So many questions, such a few minutes to get through all of this, and all the events that dominated this week on the news front in South Africa included the Section 194 process into the fitness of Public Protector Busisiwe Mkhwebane, which got underway in Parliament this week. The SACP Congress also saw Blade Nzimande stepping down after 23 years as the party's General Secretary. And at its press conference yesterday, EFF leader Julius Malema reiterated the party's mission, the fact that President Cyril Ramaphosa feels the pressure and must vacate office. So to reflect on these and other stories making headlines this week, we're joined by legal journalist Karyn Maughan. Always good to see you, Karyn. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's start off with the Public Protector's inquiry this week. What are some of those kind of things that stood out in that particular inquiry?
I think the thing is that we must reflect on is that this is the first of its kind in South African history. And that was really emphasized by the evidence leader, Karyn Maughan, when she gave her opening address. She said essentially that this was a historic event, that, South Africa had never seen a Section 194 inquiry named after the section of the Constitution which specifically refers to the removal of the heads of Chapter 9 institutions. And that we've never done this before, I think, is something that has permeated proceedings throughout the week. Still question marks over exactly the case that the Public Protector will meet, or what evidence specifically will be led against her. Will it rely on the panel, the independent panel that, of course, Busisiwe Mkhwebane challenged at the time unsuccessfully, consisting of a judge, Bess Nkabende, and Advocate Demisa Nsibeza and others? Will the evidence be led against her be focused on that report, or will it be a wider kind of investigation as what has been proposed by Advocate Karyn Maughan and Advocate Mayosi in terms of how this investigation progresses? But as many of the processes in South Africa tend to be, it has been a very politicized hearing already. Indications from Advocate Dali Mpofu, who represents Busisiwe Mkhwebane, that they will push to call President Cyril Ramaphosa to testify. He said, in regards to certain allegations that were made on behalf, as I understand it, of Ramaphosa's lawyer, but which have been imputed to him, that Busisiwe Mkhwebane should face an investigation for perjury in relation to the CR17 litigation. Of course, early in the week, UDM MP Bantu Holomisa coming out and saying that Ramaphosa should potentially be called because state money may have been utilized in the CR17 campaign. And of course, the day later, we saw Ramaphosa coming out with a statement saying that simply wasn't true. There was no basis to call him, and rejecting such calls. But that Ramaphosa issue, as it is playing out in all spheres of society, is very much playing out in this inquiry at the moment.
Do you think this is going to give a big setback? I mean, given now what Advocate Dali Mpofu has said, that the president must come and testify before the committee?
Well, they have a few, hurdles to get over. The chairperson of the committee and the evidence leader need to agree that this is appropriate. And Ramaphosa's evidence does need to be relevant to the inquiry. There have been a number of concerns raised by some of the MPs, including Freedom Front Plus MP Karyn Maughan, that this inquiry is straying into areas that, strictly speaking, aren't relevant to it. It is there to establish whether a case has been established of incompetence or misconduct against Public Protector Busisiwe Mkhwebane, who is currently on trial for perjury related to the South African Reserve Bank investigation. So, they will have to make a case that calling Ramaphosa is incredibly relevant to the investigation and needs to happen. But it's already apparent that should they not get their way in that sphere, they are very likely to litigate. The entire process that led us to where we are now has been strewn with the carcasses of many, many court cases, almost all of which the Public Protector has lost. She did succeed in the Constitutional Court in arguing that she was entitled to legal representation in this process, and I think that was rightful. That was a kind of right-minded litigation that she embarked on. But all the other cases have somehow, the interdicts, various other matters which her office has now chosen some of them to fund, but some of them not, have not been successful and have tended to fixate on the same points over and over again.
This is not the first time, I'm just going to jump from story to story, but it's not the first time that the president has been dragged into something. I mean, we saw the president also being dragged into the Senzo Meyiwa trial in a rather bizarre way, with Advocate Tefo stepping down, saying that he is being totally intimidated, and the office that is actually leading the charge for the intimidation against him is President Ramaphosa's office. And this, of course, has been denied emphatically by the president's office. But I mean, what went down there?
I mean, this is the unfortunate thing, Leanne, is that we as a country are in such a dire state. We are in the midst of a really unbelievable energy crisis in the middle of winter. We are a majority poor country where people are suffering manifestly. This is a global phenomenon because of the impact of COVID, the war in Ukraine. But South Africans are feeling it, and we see protests around the world for countries in similar situations. We see what's happened to Sri Lanka. You know, we obviously have an apprehension that that could happen to us. And in the midst of this, in the midst of all this chaos, so much of our discursive space is occupied by distractions that really do not deserve to be distracting it. Ramaphosa does have a case to answer on Phala Phala. There are clear and relevant questions that need to be asked about the presence of so much foreign currency on his farm. And of course, there are current engagements with the Namibian authorities about certain issues that happened there, and whether there was a request for mutual legal assistance that was ignored by our authorities. But park that for a moment. In a criminal trial for Senzo Meyiwa, that the case that this country has been waiting for that to be dominated by the apparent, narcissistic personality delusion of one person, fixated so much on his own self-promotion that he will drag the president into a trial that affects so many people, that has a person whose death has caused so much pain to so many people, is really, really unfortunate. If he has evidence of this, he should produce it, and it should be dealt with appropriately. But outside the sphere of that, making those kind of baseless allegations in this context just unfortunately speaks to trying to hog the headlines, and is really, really, really problematic where, in any society, but particularly in one like ours.
Yeah, I wish I could talk to you more about this particular trial, because, I mean, this is just, it's devastating for, the family especially, watching in on this, and still, now we have delay after delay, and who knows when this is going to be picked up. But I'm going to park that one there, and I'm going to go back to what we were saying about the president and now the EFF, because we had their press conference yesterday as well, and they are talking to the fact that they are going to, whatever it takes, put together a case of impeachment against the president. And all of this relating to what's happened with this Phala Phala issue, and we're still waiting to hear something from the president with regard to it. We know it happened. We were told it wasn't that much money, but it's now in the basically in those that are investigating its hands, and nothing further has been said. Not sure this is a good way to deal with this, because it's just the calls are getting louder and louder. What did you make of what the EFF was saying?
I think, the EFF is amazing because it always punches above its weight. It is an opposition party. It doesn't have the majority of votes in parliament. So, in order to succeed in an impeachment vote, you would have to get 2/3. And unless you were able to swing massive amounts of those MPs, the chances of you succeeding in an impeachment situation are not very good. But the EFF, during the presidency of, former President Jacob Zuma, were game-changing in terms of their calls for him to be forced to step down. And they did apply a lot of political pressure. And so their threats of a shutdown, their threats of they've also talked about potential court cases where they want to compel, for instance, SARS and the Reserve Bank, most pivotally, to provide answers about what happened at Phala Phala. I think that could be potentially very, very important. Remember, that for me is one of the biggest questions here, is obviously there are very serious allegations that have been made about interference in the investigation. But just outside of that, and those, that sort of, the charges that were laid by Arthur Fraser himself, a profoundly controversial figure. But outside of that, the questions around the presence of foreign currency on the farm and the disclosure of those funds to SARS, the Reserve Bank, the exchange control regulations, those are incredibly important points. And we have not seen the president come out and say, look, this was declared to SARS. All my issues are dealt with with the Reserve Bank. We haven't seen anything like that. So the EFF, in many respects, has hit the nail on the head when they say we want answers from them in regard to that. We, of course, know the taxpayers' information is confidential. It cannot be disclosed unless you bring some form of court application. So it's going to be interesting to see what the courts deal with, how the courts deal with that.
Yeah.
But there is a clear, there are clear questions to be asked here, and he is the first citizen. He should be answering them.
Indeed, he should. So I told you there were too many questions. I've got to steal just a minute in the news for this one, because this is in our news story, of course. The July 2022 National Congress, 23 years as the SACP General Secretary, Blade Nzimande, not contesting another term. So obviously we need to reflect on his legacy, which I don't think we've got time to do at this point in the program, but he has called for the review of the SACP relationship with the ANC, and others are asking what's new about their disgruntlement and whether the SACP would ever leave the alliance. What do you think is that standpoint?
Well, I mean, our colleague Stephen Curtis wrote an excellent piece in the Daily Maverick where he reflected upon the fact that Nzimande said the voter base of the SACP had grown sort of exponentially to about 300,000 people. And I think there's a common perception that in the context of South Africa at the moment, the ANC is bleeding and wounded. The SACP has supported them for many years, but it may well be the time for them to make a decision to split and to actually run as a party themselves, representing their membership and trying to find a space for themselves politically. Because as Stephen Curtis writes, if they don't make a move at the right time, they could essentially be a barnacle stuck to a sinking ship. It might be in their best interest as an organization to make a decision to actually run separately. So I think it's a pivotal question. I think that, Blade Nzimande certainly can be acknowledged in many spheres, not least of all his courageous stance on HIV/AIDS at the time during the Mbeki administration. But the bigger question of the future of the SACP could be pivotally important in the South African political environment of today.
All right, Karyn Maughan, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thanks very, very much for reflecting on some of the big stories that emerged this week. Of course, Karyn is a legal journalist.